So one might be tempted to approach our scripture from Luke by noticing that the temple authorities are skeptical about resurrection. That has the advantage of being true. And indeed, often folks read this passage as a kind of a debate between the adversarial stance of belief and non-belief. But is that really Jesus' concern with the folks he's teaching in the scripture? Is his concern that these people lack a certain content of belief? I don't think so. Or why else would Jesus counter their very literal question with something that's a lot more like poetry? Why would Jesus offer a mystery, a paradox, really, something lovely to ponder? The idea that to God, the dead are alive. Well, remember the riddle that the authorities pose. There are 7 brothers, 1 woman, no children, multiple marriages. Who will she be married to at the resurrection? Is that really a question on anybody's mind? It feels a little bit like a trap, and it feels a little bit to me like those story problems in grade school math that I never quite understood. What it represents for sure is a kind of narrowing of possibility. How does Jesus respond? Well, if a child asks you if the sky is blue, you could respond by explaining that short blue wavelengths scatter in the Earth's atmosphere more than long red wavelengths. You could, but should you? No, a change of register is in order with this kind of a question. And Jesus doesn't respond by just handing over some kind of new formula. He doesn't tell them what to believe. He opens a door. He doesn't give them some morsel of information, but something that's much more like an invitation to step into God's own boundless vision. So Jesus says in Luke 20:36 that those who belong to the resurrection cannot die anymore because they are like angels and children of God. That is not an answer to a riddle. It's an imaginative reframing. He is not solving a puzzle. He's opening a horizon. The ramifications of this are vast. What if, as religious people, we are not simply called to believe in certain intellectual propositions? What if instead we are called to believe a kind of reality into being, a kinder, larger, more capacious reality into being? What if it is not only our assent that matters, but our agency? What if faith isn't just the opposite of doubt, but what if faith is the opposite of a closed imagination? Why else would Jesus remind us that life can't be contained in the conventional categories presented to him? Of course, this is a deeply countercultural proposition. It's possibly even a dangerous one. We speak rightly so much today about who is under attack, but I don't want to forget to add imagination itself to that list. There isn't a fascist regime that doesn't eventually target the imagination. Art, of course, is usually the first victim, stripped of its freedom, repurposed as propaganda. Language gets reduced to slogans and hammered out in impoverished vocabularies. Even architecture is threatened. Even architecture becomes hollowed out into imperial statements, statements meant to awe and not to inspire. And in such a climate, those faculties that make us human, our capacity to imagine, to symbolize, to create, to dream, they're not just distrusted, but they are deliberately diminished. They are pressed into forms that serve domination and not liberation. And isn't this what Luke 20 is all about? Can the Sadducees, by which of course I really mean we, can we imagine a world beyond these categories given to us of misogynistic marriage, inheritance, possession? Can we imagine a world beyond that, beyond violence, beyond oppression, beyond despair? So Adrienne Rich once wrote that despair, when not the response to absolute physical and moral defeat, is like war, a failure of imagination. I struggled with those words when I first heard them because I do not want to ever blame anyone for their own despair. But I think I understand the point, especially around violence. So years ago, I had a student who was a poet, and she was preparing to work as an artist in the schools, back when we cared about such things. And she told me a powerful story about how when she was preparing for that work, she went to a high school where she observed a series of plays that had been written by the students themselves. The teachers had provided boxes of props to inspire the students, and one class had been allowed to use the prop of a gun if they wanted, and the others did not. In the class that had been allowed to use the gun, every single play they wrote concluded with someone being shot. The gun defined the limits of their imagination in plays that otherwise had no resemblance to each other. In the classes without a gun, the endings were varied and interesting. So part of my own thinking of the imagination has been informed by a friendship I have with Victoria Rowe Holbrook, who is an expert on Ottoman Islamic thought. And so through her eyes, I've been able to learn a lot about what 12th century philosopher Ibn Arabi thought about the imagination, and also the Ottoman Sufi poets, including Rumi, who's actually one of the best-selling poets in America right now. And I really appreciate how they thought about the imagination. They believed that there were actually three realms to the world. There's the sensory realm to the world where we live and we have our sense experiences. There's the intelligible realm. That's the realm of ideals and abstract truths, the things that we can perceive with our minds. But they believed in the middle was another realm, the imaginal. And the imaginal is the world of dreams and symbols and things that we perceive through our imagination, correctly perceive through our imagination, because they believed that the imagination was just as powerful as a faculty as our minds and our bodies and our fingertips. I'm not sure we have similarly high valuations of the imagination here in the Christian West. How often do we think the imagination is about making stuff up? But maybe we have hints of it. I know I appreciate, for one, that even in casual conversation, we often don't talk about my imagination. We talk about the imagination. I like that, as if the imagination is a collective faculty that we share, that it's a place where we actually touch other lives. And I think we're moving closer all the time, I hope, towards a more positive assessment of the imagination. I hope so, because I think we're being asked to do it. I think we're being asked to do what Jesus imagined. Can we imagine a world where all are children of God, where all are alive to God, where we are all children of God? Is there anything more dependent on the imagination than justice itself? Before any law is changed, before any liberation is won, someone had to picture that world, a world that doesn't yet exist, but whose reality, in some fascinating way, we testify to as religious people when we gather in each other's presence and exercise our imagination and our collective intention to believe into reality the world where this is true. Imagination is a moral power. It allows us to see not just what is, but what can be. And in that way, I would actually agree with Adrian Rich that it does keep us from despair, because it insists that brokenness is not the final word. So just a quick note, especially to those of you who are students. I don't know what life is for you exactly right now at this point in the semester. Maybe there are too many Greek verbs, maybe there's too much history, maybe there are too many practicums, maybe there's just some kind of relentless demand of study. But I hope in all of that, you will continue to do whatever it is that works for you to feed your imagination. Yeah, learn the text, master the traditions, but don't forget to guard that flame of wonder. Read poetry as well as theology. Do music, art, explore story, whatever it is that stretches your soul. And for those of you who are faculty and staff, same. You know, for the church, for the world, we need leaders who can dream. We need people who can picture a world that hasn't yet been born. We need people who can help others glimpse something of God's boundless vision. Your imagination, it's not an indulgence, it's not a luxury. It is the essence of your calling, not just as a leader, but as a human being. It is nothing short of Spirit speaking through you. Mary Oliver has a poem called The World I Live In. She begins it this way: I have refused to live locked in the orderly house of reason and proof. The world I live in and believe in is wider than that. And then her ending. I love her ending. You wouldn't believe what once or twice I have seen, but I will tell you this: only if there are angels in your head will you ever possibly see one. I hope we can prepare to do this, to stretch our imaginations, to see the children of God and angels everywhere.